Electrical gremlins. Sometimes there's nothing worse than an electrical gremlin on your bike causing you difficulties, and sometimes it's a very big pain to diagnose and troubleshoot, which is what I found out. The other day, I just got finished cleaning out my air filter on my Husky. Cleaning it out, re-oiling it, stuff like that. Got everything back together, took it for a quick rip, and this is what happened. So driving along, I pulled up behind a car and I noticed in my reflection that my front headlight was flickering. So I was noticing flickering in the headlight, and I thought maybe there was just a loose connection here or something. Then about 2 minutes later, my computer started powering off and then coming back on. So my speedometer, RPM gauge, things like that just like completely went blank, and then it would power back on again. So I thought that was pretty unusual too. And then I came to a stop and went to start my bike again and hit the starter button. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. So I thought, okay, well, first things first, let's check the fuse. So main fuse and the headlight circuit fuse. It was the headlight circuit fuse that was blown. So I simply replaced that fuse, put it in, hit the starter button again, blew the fuse. So I checked to make sure there was no shorts at the starter, at the kill switch or anything, and everything looked fine there. So I put another fuse in, and before I even hit the starter this time, blew again. So I obviously knew there was something really screwed up with my electrical system, or something that was causing problems. So I got out the old multimeter and I started tracing things around. And as you know, troubleshooting an electrical problem is just a time-staking, meticulous process. You have to just take your time, start from the very back, and work your way up. So the first thing I did is I unplugged this connector here, put the fuse back in, and it didn't blow. So obviously there's nothing wrong with the battery. There's some sort of wiring in my harness that was causing me grief. And because I was blowing fuses, I figured it was a dead short somewhere. And that is the most common problem when you're working on older machines. The ground will either rust out, or you'll have a insulated cable that's been rubbing up against the frame, or some sort of hot part on your machine that works through the insulation, and then you end up dead shorting it. So that was the first step. You obviously remove the gas tank, you get at access to the whole wiring harness, and like I said, I just basically followed this whole harness through, started working my way around to figure out what was the issue. And again, I focused on all the areas that were near my radiator, maybe near the engine, things that would get hot. Nothing. 2 hours later, I was still tracing all the way back down, and I was just kind of at a loss as to what was going on. Finally, I started taking a closer look at my headlight and the electrical components in around there, and that's finally where I figured out the problem. And as you can see, it's kind of hard to tell, but a little while ago, I had broke the horn bracket that connects the horn to the headlight assembly. It's basically a little bracket that fits on here, and the horn used to reside right about there. So I just picked up a little bracket, an L-shaped bracket from Canadian Tire, drilled a couple new holes, and I jerry-rigged it in there. Unfortunately, I somehow, over time, my horn ended up getting bent inwards, and this little red electrical connector to my horn ended up rubbing against my frame, as you can see. And when it grounded out against the frame like that, obviously electrical sparks started flying, and it's hard to see with this camera, but there's actually quite a decent sized nick in here. Like I could feel it with my fingernail where the sparks were making connection with the front of the frame there. So every time I would turn my steering wheel, that little red wire would rub against the frame, and eventually, the bare wire became exposed, and I'm sure sparks were happening every time I would turn my steering wheel. So I'm surprised nothing happened earlier than what it did. For whatever reason, it finally made a solid connection with the frame, and that's why it started shorting out and blowing my fuses. But long story short, when you've got an electrical problem, the first thing to start with is check your entire wiring harness, make sure nothing is grounding out against your frame. That's going to be the number one reason for electrical problems. But after a good 2.5 hours of tracing everything, I finally figured out what the problem was. Now I just, I simply bent the bracket back so that there's lots of space between this wire and my frame, and I'm going to obviously tape it up a lot better. But there you go, guys. Anytime you've got an electrical problem, just take your time, trace everything, and there's usually a very obvious explanation for it. The problem I had was because I just got finished replacing or cleaning out my air cleaner, I thought that, something around here was what was causing me problems. So I was focusing all my effort on these cables here, making sure that when my battery was seated and when my seat was back on the bike, I thought for sure that something I did crimped the wire or caused something. So I spent more time than necessary at the back of the bike when I should have just went over the whole thing to begin with. But lesson learned, and at least I figured out the problem. Didn't have to take it into a shop and have them spend $80 an hour trying to figure out what it was on their own. Again, it was just something simple that was probably a result of my own stupidity and not making sure that I had that properly insulated, but there you go. Gremlin solved. Ready to ride again.